As I'm sure most people here know, Michele Terry is an Olivier Award-winning English actress and writer, known for her extensive work with Shakespeare's Globe, the RSC, the National Theatre, and in April of this year she became Artistic Director of the Globe. Leading Shakespeare roles she has played have not been limited by gender. They include Rosalind Titania and also Henry V, and this year Hamlet. So welcome to Michele Terry. Thank you so much for joining us. You've introduced gender-blind casting this year at the Globe in some of the season's productions. What would you say were the value and the benefit of gender-blind casting?
Yeah, I think first of all I have to question whether that's what I brought in, because I think I brought in, and it's not new, that it was already here with Emma, but we brought in 50-50. And I think the appropriation, is the useful term has been, are you gender blind or gender conscious? And I think there's something about sounding gender blind makes it sound like you are asked not to see someone's gender, which is just completely impossible. So I think I have to probably get better when I speak to not drop in terms that then get used as a description of what we're doing. So I think gender blind is quite confusing. But what we're bringing in is an equal representation of men and women on stage across the seasons, and not in all the plays, which is why Amelia could be all female, but across the season the aim is to be 50-50.
Yeah. So how does the process work where you cast someone into a role that perhaps is the opposite of their gender?
It's brilliantly complicated, and we're not at a place yet where we can just have a list of, in an ideal world you want to be at a place where you can go, which is the best person for the job, and just have in a casting process you form lists of people and then you meet the people, and every now and again people just get direct offers, but in the main you have to audition for the part. And we're not in a world yet where that list is as diverse as it should be, because we still have to have really difficult, knotty conversations around what does it mean to put a man in this part, or a woman in this part, or an able-bodied actor in that part, or a woman of race in this part. It's beautifully complicated, but it can't be done unconsciously yet, because our unconscious bias, even if we don't mean to, we still live with a legacy and a memory of these plays, which are predominantly white, male, able-bodied people playing the roles. So at the moment, it's a challenge, and I don't think I'd be speaking out of turn for anybody that's worked on this season, or for Karishma Balani, our amazing head of casting here. It's really personal, and I think that's where I keep getting surprised by with how personal a conversation it is. And even we're rehearsing Macbeth at the moment, and we've got a woman of colour playing Macduff. And I knew that in the casting process there was a conversation with the director about what would happen. Should we change the pronouns or shouldn't we? And it was decided in the audition process the pronouns wouldn't change. And then suddenly, in the doing of it, it's become really hard for Anna Maria to... It's a complicated conversation to talk about manliness as a woman. Now, unfortunately, we haven't got enough time in this rehearsal process to delve into the knots of those conversations. That's why you need a massive amount of research and development time before rehearsals even begin, so that every decision you make is not only conscious to the play, but also conscious to the person that's playing it. And also then, we then also have to question, what are we doing to the plays every time we make these decisions? Are we stretching them too far? Can these plays sustain and contain these really difficult conversations that we're asking of them? I don't think anyone's broken a Shakespeare play yet by doing it, but we'll keep trying. Yeah.
How much do you feel able to change the text? And we talked about changing pronouns potentially, but are there other, when you're coming through the rehearsal process, can you think of any particular instances where the text itself looked like a bit of a barrier? the casting?
Personally, I haven't, and that's why I think it's important that this is all through my personal practical experience rather than anybody else's, because I think it would depend on who you're interviewing. I thought it would come up in Henry. I thought that we would encounter some issues when I was playing Henry V. But brilliantly, and maybe because he knew he had an all-male company, I'm not sure. We're so preoccupied with gender. I'm not sure how preoccupied he was, because very quickly it becomes about what does that human being want. And only when I got to the point in Henry V, when it got to the final scene with Catherine and Henry, I suddenly became aware that I was a woman. Up until that point, it had just been, we've got to get England, we've got to get front. It became, we know what's driving him and doing whatever it would take to get it. And then suddenly I was really aware of my gender in the scene with Catherine, who I suppose we, in some way, had solved the knotty problem by making Catherine played by a man, and a really, really beautiful man. We couldn't figure it out, and I was doing my best acting to cover up the problems, but it just didn't feel right, and it didn't feel authentic to me. And on the last day in rehearsal, I feel like I'm trying to play. I've read the notes, I've read the editor's editions, I've sort of got an image of people playing the scene, but it's not my image. And I think what I tried to do was solve the problem of the scene in the way that I had inherited, which was this strong warrior now faced with this beautiful day, must go all simpery. And I just thought, why? Because Catherine is just another piece of territory for him to conquer in order to get what he wants. For me, that was for me. Somebody else would come up with a completely different conundrum, but then I go, that's why we've got another 500 years of exploring these plays. But I think in a similar way with the authorship question, that what we have to do now is keep dropping the assumptions and dropping the legacy. And I think we've also inherited an industry that's really become reliant on authentic casting. So, which wasn't the pressure of the plays then. Boys were playing women, boys were playing old men. It really was. Acting was about transformation and the craft of transformation, and the transaction with the audience was very much an imaginative transaction. But what we do now is try and do authentic casting. So even with the Hamlet and As You Like It we did this season, even though it was 50-50, it was still quite authentic. You could imagine, I sort of just put me as a late 30s woman into that role, and you could imagine that Jack is right. But we didn't really, I think the only bit of casting that was sort of in any way beyond the rounds of authenticity was me playing old Adam. But because of the transaction of the play that we'd set up, I sort of had to play old Adam like me with a grey wig. But whereas, I suppose, if with the tour company, for example, it was 8 actors, and really early on, the audience knew they were engaged in something different. So there was no expectation of authenticity. And so it just demands a different playing style. So I think that it's so brilliantly complicated. And then when you bring in the amazing question of where are you playing it? Where are you doing these plays? And we don't have the responsibility at the Globe of £90 ticket prices. So you don't have to then layer onto that production value. Have you got the star in the role? That the space is the star, Shakespeare's the star, and for £5 you can afford to have an opinion. So if you don't like what we've done with the play, and people do, but if you don't like what we've done with the play, then brilliantly somebody else will be doing it. There's 5 other Macbeths going on at the moment, so if you don't like ours, then you've got 4 others to choose from.
That's excellent. So you mentioned the authorship question and the idea of dropping assumptions. What's your, where are you on the authorship question spectrum?
Yeah, I think this is not useful, but it changes all the time.
I think that is quite useful.
And it becomes, and there's sort of the academic in me that's fascinated by the exploration of it, and then there's the practitioner in me that goes, what's useful? What can I actually play? And as a purist, I go, got to use the first folio, that's the original. And then you suddenly encounter different versions of the play, and you Hamlet, all those different versions blew my mind as to what was possible. And then suddenly go, oh, absolutely cut all the soliloquies, that's amazing, we'll be in the pub by 9:30. They weren't, and they weren't in the quarto, so it's sort of where you can use it to your advantage. And I think certainly coming into Macbeth, and again the assumption of, without knowing what the stage direction is in that first scene, the audience that has never seen this play encounters 3 bodies on stage. At no point in that scene do you know whether they are male, female, or witches. And so to look at that and go, okay, that's really interesting. And then the next scene, you sort of start to apply your preconceived ideas of glee. They must be really gleeful about the fact they're going to get this pilot's thumb. And you go, hang on a minute. Still, I'm playing the history that they must be witches. What if there's still just 3 bodies on stage talking about, where have you been? Killing swine, right? Where have you been? Well, that it's not until later on, and then Arointly witch is something that somebody else calls the first witch. And then the next time you meet them, it's hubble bubble, toil and trouble. And then you go, oh, Shakespeare probably didn't write that bit. That was probably Middleton. So what happens if you take that bit out, and the dramaturgy of the play completely changes when you remove those Middleton scenes. As a purist, I go, everything must have been by Shakespeare. And I go, oh, when you encounter the scholarly debate and did he or didn't he, the plays reveal themselves in the most amazing way, and the fluidity that we need in the SWP is so much better without those Middleton scenes, and the dramaturgy, and it's complicated. Those scenes have been put in to explain time lapses. Well, what if you don't explain time lapses? What if this is make-believe, and that you will fill in what happens in those gaps? Now, if we were in the Globe, we might need those, because there might be a costume change that needs to happen, and we might have to put them back in. Do you know what I mean? So where they become practical, but suddenly encountering the scholarly debate and the practical debate just allows the plays a completely different life for me.
Yeah. Sorry, what's the SWP?
Oh, some want to make a playhouse.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
It's the lingo.
That's great to know. So it's about dropping assumptions can be really, really useful, because you get a different...
Well, if we are going to try and encounter these plays every time and as an actor, again, because we don't have the £90 ticket price, people don't have to go away and have decided a huge concept for which these plays must exist in. What you can have is just human beings saying these words to each other. And if we did the Macbeth scene now, it would be so different to what you see down. It could be just because we're saying those words to each other. And I think if we want to keep encountering these plays as if they are new works, we're going to have to keep drop what we think we know.
What do you think? Because you commissioned Amelia for this season, and it had an extraordinary reception, didn't it? What do you think about? Because it does offer the premise that Amelia's words in Othello. How far would you go down that line?
I think there may be things that Amelia said that are in Othello, which I think is what the play posits.
Is what it says. Yeah, that
as opposed to she's written them down and he's just nicked them. But I do. Having got there's a writer in the room now, so you tell me if this is inaccurate. But when you're conceiving a play, I don't think you ever stop working. So even if you're at dinner and you happen to be talking about a recorder, the recorder becomes a metaphor for something really interesting about the play that you might be thinking about going on to write. So I think writers are sponges. The best writers are the best sponges that absorb so much information. And the best writers unapologetically say that they're thieves, like that what could seem like a harmless conversation in the pub suddenly appears in your play, because at the time when that person was conceiving of that world, that was the best articulation. And I think a lot of the plays do read like verbatim. Certainly Rosalind is just an extraordinary. It's like whoever the writer is has so embodied that person. So having lived with these ideas, and then getting these things, it just falls off the page. So I think whoever is writing them absorbs their characters in the most dense way, so it does sound like verbatim and reads like verbatim when it comes on the page.
And interestingly, there's that thing of it's easy to take something in the place and as Anthony Sher did, and suggest that this is actually the author himself. There's always that difficulty of conflating the author with their characters. So what would you say about the idea that Shakespeare was a misogynist? What's your view on that?
This is being recorded, isn't it?
Well, we can always edit it out if you wish afterwards.
Oh yeah, excellent. Power of the edit. I think you could argue Lear is a misogynist. That's a way of playing Lear. I think it's a bit simplistic, or I think you can't make the direct link. I think the fact that you're all here considering who the writer is means that the writer is brilliantly disguised. So I think it's not too far an imaginative leap to go maybe Lear's a misogynist, but I think to make the direct reference to Shakespeare doesn't sit comfortably with me.
Yeah. Okay. In what ways do you think are women still disadvantaged in the theatre, or are they?
I think there are systems that are unconscious. I think we've all inherited those systems. So the idea that anyone is now to blame for those systems is inaccurate, because we're now all living as a result of systems that have been put in place a long time before any of us existed. But I think the systems have exhausted themselves for everybody. So I think we now have a lot of work to do to make what is unconscious conscious. And again, like, to be practical, I remember somebody saying to me when I was doing Henry V, had said, I've done a lot of work with women that play men, and the one thing we've discovered is men just take up more space. And I thought, wow, that's not only insulting generally, it's insulting to my husband, who's an actor, who's one of the most, who, having grown up with lots of women in his family, is so in touch with the feminine in him that has struggled his whole life in a system that is hyper masculine. And he takes up no space at all. So I'm going to play Henry V like him. So I think it's complicated, and I think we talk about the laziness, and I think there's lazy activism, and I think if in order to be progressive, I think we've all got to get as complicated as the discussions are.
I'd like to throw it open to the floor if you want to get some questions ready for Michele, but I'll just offer you one more. You seem to have done terrifically well. Do you feel that you have personally hit against problems being a woman in your profession?
Yeah. I don't think I would be doing what I'm doing if I felt that I had... It's because I have felt disempowered that I have tried to get myself into a position where I have a bit more power.
Yeah. Fantastic. Anyone got a question for Michele?
I don't have a question, I just have a comment. I must say, I'm embarrassed to say, but I didn't know who you were. And
Good.
you are fabulous. I am so glad you are in the Globe. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes.
I enjoyed watching Hamlet, but it seemed to me that all the gender castings in Hamlet arose from the decision that Hamlet would be played by a woman. So the decision to cast Ophelia as a man sprang because it sat with Hamlet being a woman. Do you think that's a fair comment? And if so, is it possible to ignore gender in together a cast?
No, it's not possible, and I think actually we weren't conscious enough about the decisions that we were making. And it's interesting that your interpretation meant that it's sort of because decisions have been made, the idea is that they were made consciously. And so you've imposed a narrative where we must have decided that because Hamlet's a woman, therefore Ophelia is a man. And I wish I could say that's absolutely right, and the rigour behind that is blah, blah, blah. It wasn't. It was, we knew that we had to have 50-50, and we knew that we were going to have 12 in the company. And I think we did always know that Hamlet would be a woman and Rosalind would be a man, that it was important to me that equality. But what's interesting is that the audience didn't necessarily come and see them as two things. So anyone that came to watch As You Like It independently heard me going on about 50-50 and then why is one of the best roles in Shakespeare being taken by a man? Because actually they were always meant to be seen as a pair. So I think we needed to have been much more conscious about the decisions that we made. Although, not to justify anything, but what I did think, what did get revealed was, what was important to me was I just keep playing Hamlet until I come across things that mean I have to question his own gender. But saying things like frailty, thy name is woman, seems to me a perfectly plausible thing to say, this generalised comment from a man who's in total grief that blamed all womankind when actually he really wants to blame his mum. Where things got, and I don't know how different people interpreted it, but there was something about having Ophelia as a woman, that in those scenes, this man that has been thought of as the noble prince, the hero, the misogyny of the things that he says to Ophelia in the player scene about when she says, there's a fair thought to lie between a maid's legs, nothing. Sort of in the Time's Up Me Too campaign, somehow, and it was never, we didn't play it like this, but somehow the misogyny of that particular encounter between two individuals was somehow revealed because it was a woman playing it to a man, that somehow it sat on people's ears differently, and maybe at different times when you saw it in the season, but if you've been watching all the Harvey Weinstein stuff on the news and then you come and see that production, you can't help but bring what you've absorbed in the day. So where things may not have been conscious enough, I think happy accidents emerged from it. But again, then I also fear if we start to become too contrived. So for example, when you talk about all-female companies, I don't know how you start to, which would actually solve the gender problem. These are plays that were single gender. We could remove the complication if we just put one gender on stage and remove everyone's problem with it, and let's just put the play on. We can't do that anymore because every decision we make somehow with gender becomes this film through which you then see the play. And sort of everything, I think what we need to do is try and what decisions can we make to strip the film away so you are able to hear the play or see the play as if for the first time.
Sorry, I'm sorry to come back. I sort of felt like, I know it's kind of customary to tell people that they're wonderful, but I thought it was phenomenal. But I kind of felt from time to time that there was almost a mocking of gender. That gender had become something important in a different way. And that, for example, Ophelia was almost a mockery of what happens to the man as Ophelia.
Did everyone hear that? Okay.
Yeah.
The gentleman said that he almost felt that there was a mocking of gender.
Yeah. I felt gender became very important in a different way. It was a sort of mocking of Ophelia being a man, and therefore there was it felt to me as if there was some sort of mocking of gender. I was really looking forward to seeing the thought of a gender blind casting. I was really looking forward to seeing a Hamlet where gender wasn't the issue, and it's something you said earlier about character being the issue, the behaviour of people, and how I find it fascinating how, you know, playing a woman as a man and playing a man as a woman brings out different qualities in the man or in the woman, which I think are interesting in terms of understanding the character. And I was hoping that Hamlet would have lots and lots of interesting characters. It seemed to me that just to go back to a different exploration of gender, which I found disappointing.
Did you want to sort of summarise that in your answer? So
well, so that somehow you felt the gender was somehow being mocked in places through the production. And I think that comes back to, again, how complicated the questions are, because that came down to aesthetic, I think. And I think the minute Ophelia walked, which we couldn't have predicted, but the minute that a man walks on stage in a dress, audiences found that funny. So we could never get back from that. The aesthetic was already in place, and somehow a woman walking out in jeans and a jumper, which is what I did as Hamlet, that doesn't really bother people anymore. But a man walking out in a dress is not an aesthetic that we're used to, and it meant that the ripples of gender suddenly became comedic, even if the intention wasn't meant to be.
Well, it has associations with drag, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Drag is such a strong thing that we are aware of as men dressing as women, and there
Yeah.
is always something that's usually played in a funny way.
Yeah.
So that
And the
it's
plays
hard to-
contain drag.
Yes.
The plays, the DNA of the plays contain homoerotic relationships. They contain
Yes.
drag, but somehow again we've got to be so much more conscious about those decisions. And we'll never be able to predict audience responses, but it was revealing, and it was something we could never get back from. Like every time Ophelia walked on stage, and if we had kids in the audience, that set something in motion, and then that just sets a tone. So again, depending on when you came to the play, there were so many variables in that space that set up an event for that, or set up that happening.
Presumably, you could have cast Ophelia as a woman and had the relationship as a lesbian relationship.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and again, in As You Like It, this is not. I think it's all baby steps. But As You Like It, we didn't have Rosalind and Orlando as two men. We switched Orlando, so we missed out on the complication of that homoerotic relationship as well.
Yeah.
Would it have been a lesbian relationship? Who you presumably playing Hamlet as either androgynous or male?
Well,
There's
and
no
that-
particular
yeah.
significator to say that just because you have a female body, you were playing Hamlet as female.
Yeah.
I read you in the way it was potentially written. Are you familiar with E.P. Vining's The Mystery of Hamlet, which I'm going to potentially talk about in a minute? His theory was, and there's lots of things that he backs it up with, that Hamlet, the character, is a cross-dressing heroine. That it's a wacky theory, but the things he brings out in the text are interesting. So that Hamlet was actually born female and raised as male for political reasons.
Right.
And brings out all the things.
Wow.
And makes loads of points to back that up. It's one of those wacky things. It was
Yeah.
written in 1810 or something.
But that's what's so amazing. These plays should be kaleidoscopic, and I think here, particularly at this theatre, we should have a responsibility to offer up kaleidoscopic interpretations that are free. You can't control 1,600 people's way of thinking.
Because we're discovering more and more how fluid gender is, then our portrayals of gender should
Yeah.
therefore, and in Shakespeare we have a wonderfully fluid array of gender portrayal. As a
Yeah.
performance.
There is a wonderful
Yes.
1921 silent film
Astor
of
Nielsen.
Hamlet, Astor Nielsen, which she plays exactly that.
Well, she was inspired by the mystery
She
of
was,
Hamlet.
and
yeah.
I did a live score to it. It's 2 hours long. Believe me, that is a lot of music. But it is fascinating because in that story, in her story, Ophelia is in love with her, but she's in love with Horatio. So it's kind of an extraordinary kind
She,
of
as in
joining.
Hamlet, is in love.
Yes,
But I
Hamlet's
think
in love
that's,
with Horatio.
and I think that's in
And
the play
Ophelia's
too.
in, so it's like everybody loves someone that doesn't
Yeah.
love them back.
So people have said that Vining wrote that because he couldn't deal with the idea of Hamlet being homosexual.
Yes.
So he wrote this theory that Hamlet was woman because Hamlet's so clearly in love with Horatio. But what if Hamlet's in love with Horatio and Ophelia?
I'm going to say, I think that, and I think
Why
that is
shouldn't
true.
Why not she?
I think we're going to have to pull it to a close at that. The burgeoning complications of gender in the plays, and you can see again the sort of limitless nature of Shakespeare. But thank you so much, Michele,
thanks
for joining us today.